Con sẽ điều hành công ty cho ta.
Mr. Hoan transferred the entire company into James's name, a decision no one saw coming, and one that shook everything James and Diep believed. Was this a final act of control, or a silent apology years too late? As power changes hands, one question lingers in Diep's heart. Does this mean Mr. Hoan has finally accepted her, or is love still the price James must pay?
No one ever imagined that acceptance would arrive wrapped in silence. The morning Mr. Hoan announced the transfer of the entire company to James's name, the air inside the office felt heavier than usual, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Outside, the city moved on. Vendors called out to early customers, motorbikes rushed past like flowing water. But inside that room, time seemed to pause. James sat across from his father, his hands clenched together, unsure whether what he had just heard was a reward, a test, or a farewell disguised as generosity. For Mr. Hoan, power had always been his language. He rarely spoke of emotions, rarely explained his reasons. Control was how he loved, even when it wounded the people closest to him. That was why this decision felt unreal. The company, built with decades of ambition, pride, and stubborn sacrifice, was now being handed over without a single condition spoken aloud. No lectures, no warnings, only a quiet signature sliding across the table. James accepted the documents, but his heart refused to settle. He should have felt victorious. This was what he had once fought for, the right to stand on his own, to make decisions without being watched like a child. Yet instead of triumph, a hollow ache spread in his chest. His thoughts drifted, not to profits or boardrooms, but to Diep.
Diep was not there that morning. She was at home, preparing breakfast, unaware that her name echoed silently between every line of that contract. To James, she was the reason he had learned to resist, to choose love over obedience. To Mr. Hoan, she had long been the unacceptable variable, the woman who did not fit into carefully drawn plans. When James later told Diep the news, she froze, the spoon in her hand trembling slightly. "Does this mean he accepts me?" she asked softly, her voice barely rising above the sound of boiling water. James did not answer right away. He looked at her, at the small kitchen they shared, at the quiet life they had built with patience and scars. He realized then that power could be transferred in a moment, but acceptance was far more complicated. This decision felt like a door opening, but no one knew what waited on the other side. And as hope slowly crept into Diep's eyes, uncertainty lingered, asking a question neither of them was ready to answer yet. Acceptance does not always arrive with warm words. Sometimes it comes disguised as distance. That evening, after the papers had been signed and the office lights turned off, James walked home under a sky heavy with clouds. The city lights blurred through his thoughts, each street reminding him of how far he had traveled, from a son living under command to a man standing at the edge of his own authority. Yet with every step forward, the weight of his father's decision pressed harder on his chest. Diep waited for him at home, her presence steady and familiar, like a small lamp glowing in the dark. She listened quietly as James spoke, her eyes reflecting both hope and caution. She did not celebrate. She did not ask about numbers or titles. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most. "Did your father say anything about me?" James shook his head. Silence had been Mr. Hoan's only explanation. In the days that followed, the company responded quickly to the change. Employees smiled more carefully around James now. Partners spoke with renewed respect. On the surface, everything looked like success, but behind closed doors, James felt an invisible line still drawn between his father and Diep. The transfer of power felt less like forgiveness and more like retreat, as if Mr. Hoan had stepped back, not to embrace, but to observe from afar. Diep sensed it too. When she visited the office for the first time, she walked slowly, unsure of where she belonged. Whispers followed her steps, not cruel, but curious. She smiled politely, yet her hands tightened around her bag.
Acceptance, she realized, was not guaranteed by documents or signatures. It lived in people's hearts, and hearts were far harder to change. That night, as they shared a simple meal, Diep spoke softly. "Maybe this is his way of letting go," she said. "Not approving, not rejecting, just stepping aside." Her words lingered in the air. James understood then that his father's gift might not have been an act of love, but an act of surrender, to age, to exhaustion, to battles he no longer wished to fight. And surrender, unlike acceptance, carries no warmth. Still, as Diep reached for James's hand, hope quietly survived. Life, after all, often mirrors moments like these, when parents loosen their grip, not because they agree, but because time forces them to choose peace over control. Whether that peace could grow into understanding remained uncertain, but for now, James and Diep stood together, learning that even silence can be the beginning of change.
Silence, when it stretches too long, begins to speak in ways words never could. Weeks passed after the company was transferred, and Mr. Hoan vanished from the rhythms of James's daily life. No phone calls, no unexpected visits. Even his name seemed to dissolve from conversations, as if everyone had silently agreed not to touch a fragile wound. On the surface, life appeared calmer, yet beneath that calm, something restless stirred, like a lake pretending to be still, while currents moved wildly below. James threw himself into work. His days began before sunrise and ended long after the city lights blinked on. Decisions came fast, responsibilities faster. He learned quickly that power was not freedom, it was a heavier chain forged from expectations. Sometimes, as he sat alone in the office, he wondered if this was what his father had felt all those years, trapped in a role he created but could no longer escape. Diep watched him quietly. She woke before him to prepare breakfast, waited late into the night with untouched tea growing cold beside her. She did not complain, but her eyes carried questions she never asked. In ordinary moments, folding laundry, watering plants, helping little Nee with homework, she felt the absence of Mr. Hoan like an empty chair at the table. Not painful, but unsettling, as if something unfinished lingered in the air. One afternoon, Diep visited the old house where Mr. Hoan used to live. The gate was locked, dust settling along the edges like forgotten memories. Neighbors spoke in low voices. Some said he had gone abroad. Others believed he was simply hiding from a life he no longer recognized. Diep stood there longer than she planned, wondering if acceptance sometimes required disappearance, if stepping away was the only way Mr. Hoan knew how to stop hurting his son. That night, James confessed something he had been carrying alone. "I thought I would feel lighter," he said, his voice breaking, "but the quieter it gets, the heavier my heart feels." Diep held his hand, understanding more than she could explain. In daily life, people often think resolution comes with clear endings, apologies spoken, doors closed, but reality is softer, messier. Sometimes closure looks like unanswered calls, empty rooms, and learning to live with what was never said. As the rain began to fall outside, tapping gently against the windows, Diep realized that acceptance might not arrive in dramatic gestures. It might come slowly, disguised as time, distance, and quiet reflection. And somewhere in that long silence, Mr. Hoan might finally be listening to his own heart and to the love he once refused to see. Some endings do not arrive with applause. They arrive quietly, like dawn slipping through a half-open window. It was an ordinary morning when everything finally shifted. The sky was pale, undecided between rain and sun. Diep was rinsing rice in the small kitchen, the familiar rhythm grounding her thoughts, while James sat nearby, tying his shoes for another long day. Life had settled into routines again, simple, fragile, and real. And perhaps that was where truth liked to hide. A letter arrived just before noon, no return address. The paper was slightly creased, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times before being sent. James recognized his father's handwriting immediately. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something closer to hope. Mr. Hoan did not write long explanations.
There were no justifications, no dramatic apologies, only quiet sentences, heavy with reflection. He admitted he had believed control was love, that authority could protect his son from pain. He confessed how wrong he had been. "I gave you the company," the letter said, "not because I am strong enough to accept everything, but because I am finally brave enough to step back." There was a pause in James's breathing as he read the final lines. Mr. Hoan did not say Diep's name directly. Instead, he wrote, "The person who stands beside you and makes you kinder, do not let her walk alone." That was all.
James folded the letter slowly. For the first time in years, his shoulders relaxed. Acceptance, he realized, did not always come wrapped in clear words or public gestures. Sometimes it came indirectly, through restraint, through letting go, through choosing silence over control. In everyday life, people often wait for grand approval, a blessing spoken aloud, a door opened wide. But life rarely works that way. True acceptance can be subtle. It can look like distance instead of interference, trust instead of judgment. As Diep rested her head on James's shoulder, she smiled gently. Happiness, she knew, was not the absence of conflict, nor the victory over someone else's pride. It was the quiet courage to keep choosing love, even when acceptance came without applause. And in that quiet, their future began, soft, imperfect, and finally their own.
This story teaches us that true love and acceptance cannot be forced. They must grow from understanding and reflection. Parents may believe that control is a way to protect their children, but excessive control can become a silent wound, pushing loved ones farther away instead of keeping them close. Letting go, though painful, is sometimes the bravest form of love. The story also reminds us that acceptance does not always come with clear words or grand gestures. Sometimes it appears quietly through actions, restraint, and trust. Learning to recognize these subtle signs helps us find peace instead of constantly waiting for open approval. Most importantly, happiness is built in everyday life. It grows in shared struggles, simple routines, and the courage to stand by the people we love even when the path is uncertain. When we choose empathy over pride and love over fear, we allow relationships to heal, and we give ourselves the freedom to live a life that truly belongs to us.